Have you ever felt like you had something deep inside, something that needed to be said, but no words would come out? Maybe it was pain. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was a prayer too fragile to speak. There are moments in life when we feel completely unheard, when we try to reach out, but no one seems to notice. That kind of silence isn't just about losing your voice. It's about losing connection. I remember hearing the story of a Vietnam veteran who returned home after years of war. He had survived bullets, bombs, and jungles, but when he came back, he didn't know how to talk about it. He sat at the dinner table with his family, smiled, nodded, but inside he was screaming. The pain had no outlet. The words were trapped. Or think of the woman in her 60s who lost her husband to cancer. She still goes to church, still sings the hymns, but she hasn't spoken to God in months, not because she stopped believing, but because grief made her silent. Today we journey to a small corner of the Gospel of Mark, a story that seems simple at first glance, just 7 short verses, but buried inside is one of the most profound miracles Jesus ever performed. Not in front of thousands, not in a temple, but in private. A man who could not hear, a man who could not speak, and a Savior who didn't just heal, he touched. What Jesus did that day tells us more than we realize about God, about compassion, and about the parts of us that have been silent for too long. Are you ready to listen? Are you ready to be opened? The road Jesus walked that day was long and winding through Tyre, Sidon, and into the region of the Decapolis. It wasn't a random route, it was deliberate. He was stepping deep into Gentile territory, far from the religious centers of Israel. There, among people considered outsiders by the Jewish elite, a group brought a man to Jesus, a man who was both deaf and barely able to speak. He didn't come by himself. Others had to carry him, perhaps family, perhaps friends, people who loved him enough to bring him to the only one they believed could help. They didn't ask for a sermon, they didn't demand a sign. They simply begged Jesus to lay his hand on the man. It's a quiet moment, no dramatic entrance, no crowd pressing in. Just a humble plea. Please touch him, and Jesus, in his compassion, did something unusual. He took the man aside away from the crowd. He didn't make a show of it. No performance, no spotlight. Why? Because healing to Jesus was never about spectacle. It was about relationship, about restoring dignity to a broken soul. Then came the actions, tender, strange, but deeply personal. Jesus put his fingers into the man's ears, then he spit and touched the man's tongue. He looked up to heaven, he sighed a deep emotional breath, and he said, Ephphatha, which means be opened. No thunder, no trumpet, just a word. And instantly the man could hear. He could speak clearly, not stumble through sounds, not mumble, but speak plainly. It's hard to grasp what that moment must have felt like. For the first time hearing birds, the rustle of leaves, the gasp of those watching, the voice of Jesus, and for the first time his own voice, free, whole, unlocked. But there's something else in this moment too. Jesus' sigh, a wordless breath filled with emotion. Why did he sigh? Some scholars believe it was a sign of his sorrow over the brokenness of the world. That even as he healed, he felt the weight of humanity's pain. Jesus wasn't just fixing a physical condition, he was entering into the suffering. That sigh, it wasn't frustration, it was compassion, a groaning of the spirit. It was as if Jesus carried in that breath all the loneliness, shame, and silence this man had ever known, and lifted it. The people were astonished. He has done everything well, they said. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. They couldn't keep it to themselves, even though Jesus told them not to spread it. Because when God opens what was once closed, when he restores what was once broken, joy overflows, silence breaks, and stories begin to rise. This was no ordinary healing. It was a sign of something deeper, a sign that the kingdom of heaven had arrived right there, among the forgotten, the outsiders, the broken. When we read about miracles in the Gospels, we often think of power, Jesus calming storms, raising the dead, feeding multitudes. But this miracle in Mark 7 is different. It isn't loud, it isn't public, it's personal, quiet, intimate, and it reveals something deeply human and divine in Jesus. His ability to see beyond the condition into the soul. His actions were not just about fixing a problem. They were about restoring dignity, touching shame, healing isolation. Let's walk slowly through his actions and feel their meaning. Jesus begins by taking the man aside away from the crowd. This alone is significant in a culture where disabilities often brought shame. Jesus shields this man from public exposure. He protects his dignity. He doesn't turn healing into a performance. This is the first glimpse of divine compassion. Jesus doesn't just heal symptoms. He ministers to the soul. Then he places his fingers into the man's ears. For a hearing person, this may seem strange, even invasive. But for someone who cannot hear, touch is communication. This was Jesus entering the man's world. A silent message: I understand where you're broken. Next, Jesus spits and touches the man's tongue. In ancient Jewish culture, spittle was sometimes viewed as having healing properties. But more than that, this act was symbolic. The man's speech was bound. He could not express himself. Jesus touches that very place of weakness, signaling this will be restored. Then comes the most striking moment. Jesus looks up to heaven and sighs. This sigh has stirred the hearts of believers and scholars for centuries. It wasn't a breath of frustration or fatigue. It was a deep expression of empathy, a holy lament. Jesus, fully God and fully man, feels the weight of the broken world. He isn't just fixing an ear or a tongue. He's bearing the pain of all humanity's limitations. It reminds us of Romans 8:26, where the Spirit intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. Jesus groaned because divine love always carries the pain of those it heals. Then with one word, Ephphatha, meaning be opened, everything changed. The man's ears were open, his tongue was loosed, he began to speak clearly. But what did Jesus really open that day? Yes, he opened ears. Yes, he freed a tongue. But he also opened a man's life. He opened connection. He opened worship. He opened community. This man had likely lived in isolation. Deafness in those days often meant being excluded, misunderstood, even thought cursed. He may have sat silently at family gatherings. He may have been the last to hear news, the last to understand a joke. People might have looked at him with pity, or worse, with contempt. And suddenly that world cracked open. Imagine the sound of wind in trees after a lifetime of silence. Imagine hearing your name for the first time. Imagine speaking, really speaking, and being heard. Jesus didn't just change his biology, he changed his humanity. He entered into that man's deepest wound, not only to heal it, but to identify with it. This is the essence of the gospel: a God who doesn't remain distant, a Savior who doesn't heal from a throne, but steps into our silence, our shame, our brokenness, and speaks, be opened. For many of us, the areas of our lives that feel deaf or mute aren't physical, they're emotional or spiritual. We have places we don't let others see wounds. We've stopped trying to explain prayers. We've stopped praying because we no longer expect answers. Jesus' actions in Mark 7 remind us he sees, he touches, he sighs, he speaks. He meets us where we are, even in the silence. And his touch is never generic. He could have healed the man from a distance with a word, but he chose presence, he chose proximity, he chose participation. That is love. This miracle is not only for one man, it's a parable of how Jesus works with all of us. He doesn't rush healing. He doesn't shame weakness. He leads us gently out of the crowd. He speaks not just to ears, but to hearts. And if we let him, he still speaks. Ephphatha over us today. He opens what has been closed for too long: relationships, trust, dreams, worship. He opens what shame has shut. He opens what trauma has sealed. This miracle may have happened in a quiet place, but its echo is eternal. In every church pew, in every hospital bed, in every tearful prayer whispered in the night, he is still sighing, still touching, still opening. The question is, will we come close enough to feel it? To fully appreciate the depth of what happened in Mark 7:31-37, we must first understand the world Jesus stepped into. This wasn't just a story about healing. It was a bold act in a controversial place involving people who were often overlooked and excluded by the religious elite of the day. The miracle takes place in the region of the Decapolis, a group of 10 cities located to the east and southeast of the Sea of Galilee. These cities were heavily influenced by Greco-Roman culture and were considered Gentile territories, non-Jewish, pagan, and outside the religious purity zones of Israel. For a Jewish rabbi to travel there, much less perform a miracle, was significant. Many Jewish leaders at the time believed that Gentiles were spiritually unclean. Physical contact with them, especially with someone disabled, would typically be avoided, but Jesus deliberately went there. By doing so, he crossed not just geographical boundaries, but social and religious ones as well. He didn't go as a politician, he didn't go to debate theology, he went to bring compassion, to show that the kingdom of God was not limited by race, culture, or status. Now let's consider the man in the story. He was both deaf and had a severe speech impediment. In the ancient world, such conditions were often seen not just as physical problems, but as signs of sin or divine punishment. Many believed that someone born with a disability or struck with one had done something wrong, or that their parents had sinned. This belief added layers of shame to those already suffering. The deaf and mute were often excluded from temple life, religious instruction, and social functions. They couldn't hear the scriptures read aloud. They couldn't participate in worship like others. They were physically present, but spiritually invisible. Jesus' decision to heal this man in private was not just a sign of kindness, it was a radical move against the norms of exclusion. Even the method he used, touching the man's ears and tongue, would have been considered unclean by religious standards. Yet Jesus was never afraid to be misunderstood. He cared more about the person in front of him than the criticism behind him. What's more, his word, Ephphatha, was spoken in Aramaic, the common language of the region. Though Mark wrote his gospel in Greek, he preserved this one Aramaic word. Why? Because it wasn't just a command. It was a declaration, a spiritual unveiling, a sign that the boundaries between heaven and earth were being removed, that the silent would speak, that the excluded would be restored. This healing in this location for this man was a message to the world. God's mercy is not bound by borders, His grace is not reserved for the elite, and His miracles are not limited to the temples or the clean. Jesus showed that the heart of God beats just as loudly in Gentile regions as it does in Jerusalem. He shattered the notion that holiness was about distance or ritual. Instead, he showed that true holiness draws near to pain, steps into impurity, and brings wholeness where others saw defilement. This miracle may seem small in words, but it was massive in meaning. The miracle of the deaf and mute man is more than a historical event. It is a mirror for us today. In a world full of voices, noises, and messages, many of us are still spiritually deaf and emotionally mute. We hear but do not listen. We speak but do not connect. We exist but do not express. And in many ways, we are like the man in Mark 7. Not because we cannot physically hear or speak, but because we carry areas in our lives that are silent, shut down, or disconnected. For some, it's emotional deafness. We've grown numb to the cries of others. We no longer hear the whisper of God's Spirit. We've become so overwhelmed by busyness, pressure, or disappointment that we've stopped noticing the small but sacred voices around us. For others, it's spiritual muteness. We no longer pray like we used to. We don't testify. We no longer speak truth in love. Perhaps life has made us cautious or afraid. Somewhere along the way, our voice has been silenced. Sometimes trauma causes it. A woman in her 50s in Michigan once shared her story. After years in an abusive marriage, she finally left, but her voice remained stuck. She said, "I don't even know what I sound like anymore. When I pray, I feel like God doesn't want to hear me." Another story comes from a retired firefighter in Texas. After decades of facing danger, saving lives, and enduring trauma, he stopped talking to anyone about his pain. He said, "There's no room for weakness when you're the strong one. So I just stopped speaking." These are not isolated stories. They're modern echoes of Mark 7. People carrying deep pain, misunderstood by others, shut out of community, waiting for someone to draw near and whisper, "Be opened." And that's exactly what Jesus still does. He meets us in the silent corners of our lives. He steps into places others avoid. He speaks to wounds that no one else sees. The beauty of this miracle is not only that the man was healed, but that Jesus did it in such a personal, gentle way. That's a lesson for us too. In a culture of noise, the voice of Jesus is not harsh. He doesn't yell, he doesn't force. He draws close and speaks with kindness. It's also a reminder that healing doesn't always happen in public. Sometimes it happens quietly in our bedrooms, during a walk in the back row of a church, or through a video like this one. Jesus still leads people aside and works in private moments. So how do we respond? First, we must ask, are there areas of my life that are deaf to God? Am I no longer hearing His voice because I've filled my days with distraction or doubt? Second, we must ask, have I lost my spiritual voice? Have I stopped praying, stopped praising, stopped speaking truth because of fear or fatigue? Third, we must believe Jesus still says Ephphatha. He still opens hearts, He still loosens tongues. He still restores connection, but it begins with bringing our brokenness to Him, just like the people who brought the man that day. They didn't have eloquent prayers, they didn't have a formula, they just brought Him, and that was enough. Maybe today all you need to do is come with your silence, come with your shame, come with the areas that feel locked away and forgotten. Jesus doesn't need you to have perfect words, He only needs your willingness to be touched. And if you've already experienced His healing in your life, then maybe it's time to be the one who brings someone else, someone who's forgotten how to speak, someone who no longer believes they're worth hearing. This story calls us not only to be healed, but to become healers, to reach out to the isolated, to listen to the unheard, to speak words of life to those who've been silent for too long. Because when Jesus says, be opened, it's not just a word for then, it's a word for now. There are moments in life when no one else can hear what's going on inside you. You smile, you show up, you do what's expected, but deep inside you feel disconnected from people, from God, even from yourself. And maybe like the man in Mark 7, you've grown used to the silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of distance, of prayers unanswered, of wounds unspoken, of years gone by without hearing God's whisper or speaking your own heart out loud. But today that silence can be broken. You see, the miracle wasn't just about sound, it was about restoration. Jesus didn't simply give the man his hearing and speech. He gave him a voice, He gave him a place, He gave him communion, and He's offering the same to you. No matter how long you've been silent, no matter how far you've wandered, no matter how numb your heart has become, Jesus still says, be opened. Maybe you've tried before. Maybe you've been disappointed by people, by churches, even by God. But Jesus isn't inviting you to a system, He's inviting you to Himself. He's not calling you to religion, He's calling you to relationship, one where He listens, one where He speaks gently, one where He restores. And like the man in the story, you don't need to have the right words. You don't need to explain everything. You just need to come with your silence, come with your wounds, come with your doubts, even your anger. Jesus is not afraid of your questions. He is not offended by your confusion. He is moved by your honesty. The same hands that touch a deaf man in a forgotten town are reaching for you now. And in this moment, wherever you are, you can respond. Not by doing more, not by pretending, not by fixing yourself, but by whispering a simple prayer. Jesus, open me. Open my ears to hear your voice again. Open my heart to feel again. Open my mouth to praise, to cry, to speak what's real. And if I've been silent too long, if I've drifted too far, then draw me close again. Because you still heal, you still see, you still touch what others avoid, you still love what others reject, you still whisper, Ephphatha over broken hearts. Friend, this moment could be the start of something new. Not a dramatic change, but a real one. A first step toward being heard, toward speaking again, toward faith. So let this be your prayer, Lord. I'm listening, I'm ready to be opened. When Jesus healed the deaf and mute man, He didn't just change one life. He created a ripple. One, touch, one, sigh, one word. Be opened, and suddenly the world around that man changed forever. He could hear, he could speak, but more than that, he could belong again. He could express joy, he could worship, he could tell his story, and the people watching, they couldn't stay silent. Even though Jesus told them not to tell anyone, they couldn't hold it in. Because when God truly touches your life, something inside of you has to respond. Maybe you felt that today. Maybe this story stirred something deep within you, a longing to be restored, a hunger to be heard, a desire to speak again after too long in silence. This is not just a story from 2,000 years ago. It's your story, it's our story, because all of us have places in our lives that have been shut down, parts of us that have gone quiet, dreams that have gone dark, relationships that have grown cold. But Jesus is still speaking, still touching, still healing. And the call today is simple but urgent. Don't walk away from this unchanged. If God has touched your heart, respond. If something inside you has stirred, move. If you've heard the whisper, be opened, then open your heart wider. Maybe that means kneeling down right now and praying honestly for the first time in a long time. Maybe it means reaching out to someone you've been distant from. Maybe it means coming back to your faith not through guilt, but through grace. Whatever it looks like for you, do not stay silent. Let your voice return. Let your praise rise. Let your faith awaken again. And if this video has spoken to you, if you felt the Lord drawing near in some way, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Send it to someone who may be stuck in silence. You never know what one story, one word, or one touch from God can do. And if you haven't yet subscribed to this channel, we are building a community of people who are searching, growing, and walking together in faith. Your story matters, your voice matters, and we want to walk with you as Jesus continues to open hearts and restore lives. Let this be the moment you say, "I won't stay quiet anymore." Let this be the moment your soul answers back to Jesus' whisper, "Yes, Lord, I am open."